Welcome to Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we uncover a network of influence so deeply woven into modern warfare and policy that its presence is almost invisible. From whispered boardroom deals to billion-dollar defense contracts, today we examine the military-industrial complex, the shadowy force accused of turning global conflict into profit and power into a permanent business model. The term military-industrial complex first entered public consciousness during a farewell address by President Dwight David Eisenhower in January of 1961. As a former five-star general who had led Allied forces in the Second World War, Eisenhower understood military power intimately. But as he prepared to leave office, he issued a stern warning to the American people. He spoke of a growing partnership between the armed forces and private industry, one that threatened to acquire, in his words, unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought. Eisenhower's caution was not directed at any single company or agency, but at the very structure of a new power base emerging in post-war America. Following the Second World War, the United States found itself in a unique position. The destruction of Europe and Asia had left America's industrial base intact and thriving. At the same time, the Cold War ignited a permanent arms race, one that required not just soldiers and tanks, but constant technological innovation, global intelligence networks, and private contractors to support a never-ending state of readiness. Defense spending surged, and with it, the birth of a complex web of manufacturers, research institutions, and military planners. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, major corporations like Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop had become fixtures in Washington. Their influence extended beyond supplying equipment. They funded think tanks, advised on foreign policy, and maintained revolving doors with the Pentagon. Retired generals found lucrative board seats. Politicians found reliable campaign donors. And a permanent infrastructure of war readiness settled into the American economy. This was not a secret conspiracy in the traditional sense. The relationships were public, the contracts were visible, and the spending was recorded. Yet the sheer size of the system and the normalization of its operations made it increasingly difficult to scrutinize. Military bases dotted the globe, research and development budgets exploded, and entire regions became economically dependent on defense spending, making any call for peace or disarmament a direct threat to local jobs and national industry. Throughout the Cold War, this system solidified. Whether under the banner of containing communism, fighting terrorism, or advancing technological supremacy, the military-industrial complex expanded. Critics warned that wars could be prolonged or even manufactured to justify budgets. That foreign policy might be steered not by strategic necessity, but by corporate gain, and that a democratic society was slowly surrendering its war-making powers to a coalition of unelected interests who profited from conflict itself. As the military-industrial complex grew more entrenched, a network of powerful figures and institutions began to shape the direction of global conflict and military spending. Some of the most influential voices were not generals or elected officials, but corporate executives and defense contractors, whose financial success depended on the continuation of war readiness. Key among these players were the heads of companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics, firms that provided everything from missiles to surveillance systems, from logistics to cybersecurity. These companies established a close, often indistinguishable relationship with the Department of Defense. Contracts worth billions of dollars were regularly awarded with little public oversight. In many cases, these contracts followed a predictable cycle. A new threat would emerge or be identified. Lobbying efforts would intensify, and soon funding for weapon systems, research, or deployment would surge. The more complex or undefined the threat, the easier it became to justify open-ended investment. One of the most critical features of this system was the revolving door, a term used to describe the movement of individuals between roles in government and positions in the private defense sector. High-ranking Pentagon officials would retire and quickly transition executive roles at major defense firms. Likewise, lobbyists and defense consultants would move into advisory or policy positions within the government. This constant exchange created a system where policymaking and procurement were heavily influenced by individuals with vested financial interests in military expansion. Figures like Dick Cheney, who served as Secretary of Defense before becoming vice president, had deep ties to Halliburton, a company that received enormous government contracts during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Donald Rumsfeld, a former executive at multiple corporations, also returned to public service with close ties to defense contractors. These relationships were legal and often disclosed, but their implications were significant. Decision-making at the highest levels of government was increasingly shaped by people who had profited from war and might profit again. The influence extended beyond hardware and logistics. Think tanks like the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies received funding from defense firms and often published research that supported increased military spending. Their reports were cited by policymakers and media outlets, reinforcing narratives that aligned with the interests of defense manufacturers. By the end of the 20th century, the military-industrial complex was no longer a warning. It was a reality. Its architects and beneficiaries occupied boardrooms, briefing rooms, and television studios. The boundaries between national interest and corporate profit had grown so thin that many Americans struggled to separate patriotism from business. For those watching closely, it seemed less like a conspiracy and more like an evolution, a system born from wartime necessity but matured into something far more permanent. At the center of the theory surrounding the military-industrial complex is a set of core claims that have circulated for decades. These claims suggest that war, or the perpetual threat of war, is no longer solely a matter of defense or foreign policy, but a profitable engine designed to sustain an entire sector of the economy. The most compelling argument often begins with a single question: who benefits? Supporters of this theory point to the staggering amount of money spent on defense. In the United States alone, military spending consistently exceeds $700 billion annually, dwarfing the budgets of education, healthcare, or infrastructure. This level of expenditure is not just used for weapons or soldier salaries. A significant portion flows to private corporations, subcontractors, consulting firms, and tech startups that have positioned themselves within the ecosystem of national security. The claim is not that war is faked, but that it is incentivized, made easier to start and harder to stop because of the profits at stake. Evidence often cited includes the rapid awarding of contracts following major conflicts or crises. After the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, the United States launched the War on Terror. Within weeks, defense contractors saw a dramatic increase in contracts and funding. Companies like Halliburton, KBR, and DynCorp were brought in to manage supply chains, construct bases, and provide security. Billions of dollars were spent with limited transparency, and critics argue that the profit motive became embedded in the operational fabric of war. Beyond the battlefield, the surveillance state expanded in parallel. The Patriot Act enabled unprecedented data collection, and new technologies were rapidly developed by private firms. Defense contractors partnered with intelligence agencies to monitor communication, track movement, and develop predictive algorithms. As terrorism shifted from a military concern to a domestic one, private corporations began selling solutions for problems that governments were still struggling to define. The fear of unseen enemies became a permanent justification for investment. Another often referenced claim is that foreign policy decisions are heavily influenced by defense industry lobbying. Companies spend millions each year lobbying Congress, often focusing on committees tied to defense budgets or foreign affairs. These efforts shape legislation, influence arms deals, and ensure continued funding for programs that benefit the military-industrial sector. In some cases, lawmakers have been shown to receive campaign donations shortly before approving new weapons programs or military deployments. Whistleblowers, journalists, and independent investigators have long pointed to this feedback loop: crisis, funding, lobbying, expansion, as evidence that the military-industrial complex is not just a theory, but a strategic architecture, one that thrives on uncertainty, relies on public fear and operates in a space where accountability is diffused across thousands of contracts, departments, and private partnerships. The result, they argue, is a world where peace is never profitable enough to pursue. To understand the strength of the claims behind the military-industrial complex, one must examine the evidence with care. Much of the data exists in public records: contracts, budgets, legislative votes, and corporate earnings reports. What makes this evidence so striking is not that it is hidden, but that it is often overlooked. Analysts point to patterns that emerge over time, showing how defense spending continues to rise regardless of the presence or absence of active conflict. For example, between the years 2001 and 2021, the United States Department of Defense spent over $14 trillion. Of that amount, more than half was awarded to private contractors. This includes weapons manufacturers, logistics companies, data firms, and private military contractors. Some of these corporations saw their stock prices triple or quadruple during prolonged military campaigns. These are not theoretical profits. They are measurable, reported, and legally protected by the same systems that fund them. One commonly cited example is the F-35 fighter jet program. Developed by Lockheed Martin, the F-35 is the most expensive weapon system in history. Initial cost estimates were projected at under $200 billion. By the time it reached operational status, the cost had ballooned to over $1.7 trillion, including long-term maintenance. Despite repeated technical failures, cost overruns, and international criticism, the program continued to receive funding year after year. Critics argue that the political and financial investment in the project had become too large to stop, regardless of its effectiveness. Another point of analysis involves how contracts are awarded. A process known as cost-plus contracting allows companies to charge the government for the cost of the project plus a guaranteed profit margin. This system creates little incentive to reduce costs or finish early. In fact, the longer and more expensive a project becomes, the more profit a contractor can make. While this method is legal and often justified by the complexity of defense projects, it has been repeatedly criticized for opening the door to waste and abuse. Investigations by the Government Accountability Office have documented instances where parts were drastically overpriced, services duplicated, or deliverables delayed with no penalties. In some cases, contractors were awarded new contracts while still under investigation for mismanagement or fraud. These findings have led some to believe that the military-industrial complex is protected not just by law, but by a culture of silence and interdependence. Each part of the system, government agencies, private companies, and political leaders, relies on the other to maintain stability. And yet, supporters of this system argue that it is necessary, that national defense requires rapid development, strong partnerships with industry, and the ability to respond to threats without bureaucratic delays. They emphasize the need for readiness, deterrence, and technological superiority. Critics of the military-industrial complex have raised serious concerns about the system's long-term consequences, but they are not alone in the conversation. A range of experts, analysts, and policymakers have pushed back against the more conspiratorial interpretations. They argue that while inefficiencies and ethical concerns do exist, the idea of a coordinated effort to manufacture war for profit oversimplifies a much more complex dynamic. One major counterpoint is the nature of global threats themselves. Supporters of continued military investment point to the unpredictability of international conflict. Events like the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, the rise of the Islamic State, and tensions in the South China Sea are cited as evidence that constant preparedness is not only prudent, but essential. These are not conflicts created by defense companies. They are real geopolitical challenges that demand swift and sustained responses. Skeptics of the conspiracy argument also highlight the checks and balances built into the system. Congressional oversight, internal audits, and independent watchdogs are all tasked with monitoring military spending. They argue that while corruption and mismanagement do occur, the idea that an entire industry could manipulate national policy without detection is unlikely. Missteps are often investigated. Whistleblowers are protected under federal law, and the media plays a role in exposing wrongdoing. In many cases, defense contractors are also deeply intertwined with civilian technology and infrastructure. Companies like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman develop satellite systems, air traffic control networks, and cybersecurity tools used by both military and civilian sectors. The line between public service and private profit is blurred, not necessarily by design, but by the complexity of modern global systems. Critics of the conspiracy framework caution that labeling these relationships as inherently sinister ignores the scale and scope of technological interdependence. Some argue that the perception of conspiracy is fueled in part by the scale of defense budgets. When such vast sums are involved, every decision seems suspicious. But large budgets alone do not prove intent. They reflect the cost of maintaining an advanced global military force, one with personnel stationed in over 150 countries, operating on land, sea, air, and increasingly in cyberspace and outer space. Additionally, policymakers argue that military investment often drives innovation. Technologies like GPS, the internet, and advanced materials were born from defense projects and later transformed civilian life. Without these investments, they argue, technological progress would slow and national security would weaken. Still, even those who reject conspiracy theories acknowledge the need for reform. There is broad agreement that waste, redundancy, and conflicts of interest must be addressed. The challenge lies not in exposing a hidden cabal, but in navigating the overlapping interests of public safety, private enterprise, and political power. For many, the question is not whether the military-industrial complex exists, but whether it can ever be held truly accountable. The influence of the military-industrial complex extends far beyond defense budgets and foreign policy. It has deeply shaped the way modern societies view conflict, safety, and national identity. In many countries, especially the United States, the idea of military strength is closely tied to patriotism. Recruitment campaigns, national holidays, and cultural narratives often reinforce the belief that military supremacy ensures peace. But beneath that public sentiment lies a deeper question. Has the normalization of constant warfare changed how societies function? Sociologists and political theorists have argued that when a nation's economy is deeply tied to defense, war becomes more than a foreign affair. It becomes a domestic industry. Entire cities and regions depend on military contracts. Universities compete for grants tied to defense research. Even entertainment is shaped by these relationships. Films, television series, and video games often depict military power in a heroic light, with support from actual defense agencies. The Pentagon has been known to offer script approval and equipment access in exchange for favorable portrayals, blurring the line between storytelling and propaganda. This cultural saturation has consequences. One of them is desensitization. The public becomes accustomed to the idea of war as a constant backdrop, something that happens elsewhere, involving technologies rather than people. Drones replace soldiers, satellite strikes replace invasions, and real-time coverage makes conflict feel more like content than catastrophe. In this environment, moral and ethical debates are often reduced to technical discussions about precision, efficiency, and cost. Education is also shaped by the presence of the military-industrial complex. In schools across the country, military recruiters are granted access to students, sometimes as early as high school. For many young people, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds, enlistment is marketed as a path to education and stability. While service can be honorable, critics argue that the recruitment process disproportionately targets the most economically vulnerable, turning inequality into an engine for military manpower. On a psychological level, the belief in permanent threats can foster a climate of fear and dependence. Citizens may come to view military spending not as a policy choice, but as a necessity. Proposals to reduce funding or withdraw troops are often met with accusations of weakness or betrayal. Political candidates, regardless of party, are hesitant to appear soft on defense. In this way, the influence of the military-industrial complex seeps into democratic processes, shaping debate and narrowing the range of acceptable discourse. Perhaps most significantly, the idea of war as business changes how peace is valued. If an economy thrives on conflict, then peace is not just elusive, it is inconvenient. This raises a troubling paradox. Can a system that profits from war ever truly pursue its end? Or has the pursuit of peace become incompatible with the structures we have built to protect it? These are not abstract questions. They are present in budgets, policies, and public opinion, revealing a society where security is defined less by the absence of danger and more by the presence of power. The role of the media in sustaining the military-industrial complex cannot be understated. From cable news networks to film studios and social media platforms, narratives around war, defense, and global threats are constantly shaped and delivered to the public in ways that often reflect the interests of the establishment. Critics argue that mainstream media outlets have, over time, adopted a position of alignment rather than scrutiny when it comes to military action, echoing official talking points and reinforcing a sense of urgency or fear that supports continued defense spending. One of the most visible examples of this alignment occurred in the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s. News coverage during that period was overwhelmingly supportive of the government's position, with major networks presenting intelligence claims about weapons of mass destruction as fact. Later investigations revealed that much of this intelligence was either flawed or exaggerated, but by that point, public opinion had already been shaped. Military contractors benefited from the resulting war, receiving contracts for everything from equipment production to infrastructure rebuilding. This cycle of crisis, coverage, and contract is one of the key mechanisms by which the military-industrial complex maintains momentum. Media coverage of conflict zones often lacks critical depth. Context is replaced with urgency. Spectacle overshadows substance. And dissenting voices are either marginalized or framed as unpatriotic. The effect is not always intentional, but the outcome is consistent. A public that is informed enough to feel concern, but not enough to question underlying motives or structures. The entertainment industry plays a parallel role. Military cooperation with filmmakers has been well documented. Productions that portray the armed forces in a positive light are more likely to receive support in the form of access to equipment, locations, and technical advisors. In exchange, scripts may be altered to align with Department of Defense preferences. This collaboration is not hidden. It is formalized through offices within the Pentagon, which review and approve projects based on their portrayal of military operations and personnel. Social media adds another dimension. Algorithms reward content that provokes strong emotions, especially fear and outrage. Stories about threats to national security, terrorist attacks, or geopolitical tensions spread rapidly, often without proper context or verification. In such an environment, nuanced discussion is drowned out by simplified narratives. The more a post reinforces existing fears, the more likely it is to gain traction. This creates a digital echo chamber in which public perception of danger remains high, even when statistical risk remains low. Independent journalism and whistleblower platforms have tried to counterbalance this trend, exposing misconduct, inflated contracts, and questionable alliances. But their reach is often limited by resources, censorship, or disinformation campaigns. The consolidation of media ownership into a handful of powerful corporations, some with ties to the defense sector, further complicates the landscape. In the end, the media does not just report on the military-industrial complex. In many ways, it helps sustain it, not by conspiracy, but by conditioning. A steady stream of fear, pride, and spectacle that maintains the illusion of necessity. Beyond the mainstream narrative lies a web of more speculative and fringe theories that extend the concept of the military-industrial complex into realms that challenge conventional understanding. These theories do not merely question profit motives or political influence. They suggest that war itself may be used as a smokescreen for deeper agendas involving advanced technologies, secret experiments, and hidden governance structures operating far from public view. One such theory claims that certain global conflicts are orchestrated not only to sustain economic interest, but to cover up the deployment and testing of classified technologies. In these accounts, war zones become laboratories, and civilian populations become unknowing participants in live experiments. Technologies such as electromagnetic weapons, drone swarms, and enhanced surveillance systems are said to be tested under the guise of traditional warfare. Supporters of this theory point to sudden advancements in military capabilities that appear with little public research, suggesting development through secret programs hidden beneath layers of security clearance and black budgets. Others argue that certain branches of the military-industrial complex are not entirely under civilian control. They suggest that autonomous networks within intelligence agencies and defense departments operate independently, maintaining their own agendas, funding streams, and partnerships with private corporations. These entities are sometimes referred to as deep state operators or breakaway groups, and are believed to function with minimal oversight, using classified projects and national security status to avoid accountability. Another recurring claim within fringe circles centers around the existence of underground facilities, sometimes referred to as deep underground military bases. According to these theories, dozens or even hundreds of such facilities exist beneath the surface of the Earth, connected by high-speed transport systems and housing everything from weapons stockpiles to advanced artificial intelligence research. Some theorists go further, suggesting that non-human technologies or even interdimensional research occurs within these bases, hinting at alliances or discoveries never disclosed to the public. A separate thread of speculation focuses on weaponized weather systems. This theory posits that technologies developed under military contracts may have the ability to manipulate weather patterns, creating floods, droughts, or hurricanes for strategic purposes. Devices like the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, often referred to by its acronym, are cited as possible tools in a global arsenal capable of environmental control. While the scientific community largely dismisses these claims, believers point to government patents and unexplained anomalies as circumstantial evidence. There are also claims that psychological operations, or psyops, are routinely carried out on domestic populations. This may include staged events, manipulated news cycles, and algorithmic control of social media to generate fear, compliance, or distraction. In this view, the battlefield is not just land or cyberspace. It is the collective mind of the public. Critics of this perspective argue that it crosses into paranoia, but supporters maintain that if information is power, then perception is the ultimate weapon, and the military-industrial complex knows how to wield it. When examining the military-industrial complex from every angle, institutional, economic, cultural, and speculative, what emerges is not a simple story of corruption or collusion. Instead, it reveals a vast layered system that has become deeply embedded in the very structure of modern governance and global affairs. Whether one sees it as a natural consequence of national defense or a coordinated framework of influence and control depends on where one stands and how far one is willing to look beneath the surface. What remains undeniable is the scale. Trillions of dollars have flowed through defense budgets over the past several decades, shaping not only foreign policy, but the domestic economy, the media, and even the culture itself. This spending sustains thousands of companies, millions of jobs, and an ecosystem of research and development that stretches far beyond traditional battlefields. As war has evolved, from ground troops to drones, from physical invasions to cyber operations, so too has the infrastructure that supports it. And as that infrastructure has grown, so has its ability to influence the decisions that justify its own expansion. Critics argue that the system thrives on ambiguity, on wars without end, threats without borders, and technologies without oversight. They suggest that a permanent war economy creates incentives to maintain instability rather than resolve it. That every new theater of conflict, every new enemy, and every new breakthrough in weapons design extends the life of a machine that no longer needs a traditional war to survive. From lobbyists influencing policy, to corporations shaping the direction of research, to media narratives reinforcing urgency, the complex is seen by some not just as a tool of defense, but as a driver of global conflict itself. Supporters of the system push back against this view. They frame military readiness as essential, pointing to a world filled with unpredictable dangers: rogue states, terrorism, cyber attacks, and emerging powers. They argue that without a strong and agile defense industry, nations risk falling behind technologically, economically, and strategically. For them, the military-industrial complex is not a conspiracy. It is a necessity shaped by the realities of the modern world. But perhaps the most important question is not whether this complex should exist, but how it should be governed. Who decides when a threat is real? Who sets the limits on spending? And who ensures that the pursuit of security does not come at the expense of democracy, transparency, and peace? These are not questions confined to history or theory. They are alive in every budget decision, every foreign policy debate, and every vote cast in the name of national interest. As we move deeper into an era defined by rapid technological change, information warfare, and shifting alliances, the relevance of the military-industrial complex will likely grow, not shrink. Understanding its history, its architecture, and its influence may be one of the most important steps toward ensuring that power, wherever it resides, remains accountable. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Files with Zoe Parker. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show and unlock bonus content, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.